That's the first night. Now I'm going to skip. He stays. He really would like to leave the village, but they feed him well and entertain him, so he stays for the second night, feeling that he's safe. Well, our time has come, Mr. Student, the familiar gray-haired Cossack said to him, getting up from his place together with Dorosh. Let's go to work. Homa was once again taken to the church in the same way. Again he was left alone, and the door locked on him. No sooner was he left alone than timorousness began once more to creep into his breast. Again he saw the dark icons, the gleaming frames, and the familiar black coffin standing in menacing silence and immobility in the middle of the church. Well, he said, this marvel doesn't make me marvel now. It's only frightening the first time. Yes, it's only a little frightening the first time. Then it's not frightening anymore, not frightening at all. He hastened to the choir, drew a circle around himself, spoke several incantations, and began reading loudly, resolved not to raise his eyes from the book or pay attention to anything. He'd been reading for about an hour already and had begun to weary and to cough a little. He took a snuff bottle from his pocket and before taking a pinch, timorously turned his gaze back to the coffin. His heart went cold. The corpse was already standing before him right on line, fixing her dead green eyes on him. The student shuddered and felt a chill run through all his veins. Dropping his eyes to the book, he began reading his prayers and exorcisms louder, and heard the corpse clack her teeth again and wave her arm, wishing to seize him. But looking out of the corner of one eye, he saw that the corpse was trying to catch him in the wrong place, and evidently could not see him. She was growling hollowly, and began to utter dreadful words with her dead lips. They spluttered hoarsely, like the gurgling of boiling pitch. He could not have said what they meant, but something dreadful was contained in them. The philosopher fearfully realized that she was reciting incantations. Wind swept through the church at these words, and there was a noise as of a multitude of fluttering wings. He heard wings beating against the glass of the church, windows in their iron frames, heard clack scratching iron with a rasping noise, and countless powers banging on the doors trying to break in. His heart pounded heavily all the while. Shutting his eyes, he kept reading incantations and prayers. And at last something suddenly whistled far away. It was the distant crowing of the cock. An exhausted philosopher stopped and rested his soul. Those who came to relieve the philosopher found him barely alive. He was leaning back against the wall, goggle-eyed and staring fixedly at the Cossacks, who were shaking him. They practically carried him out and had to support him all the way. Coming to the master's yard, he roused himself and asked to be given a pint of vodka. After drinking it, he smoothed his hair on his head and said, "There's all sorts of trash in this world, and such horrors happen as, oh well." That and the philosopher waved his hand. The circle that gathered round him hung their heads on hearing such words. Even the young boy whom all the servants considered their rightful representative when it came to such matters as cleaning the stables or toting the water, even this poor boy also stood gaping. Just then a not entirely old wench passed by in a tight-fitting apron that displayed her round, firm shape. The old cook's assistant, a terrible flirt who always found something to pin on her cap, a bit of ribbon or a carnation, or even a scrap of paper if there was nothing else. "Greetings, Mama," she said, seeing the philosopher. "Ay, ay, ay, what's happened to you?" she cried out and clasped her hands. "What do you mean, foolish woman?" "Oh, my God, but you've gone all gray." Oh, and it's the truth she's telling," said Spirid, studying him intently. "You've really gone all gray, like our old Yevtuk." On hearing this, the philosopher rushed headlong into the kitchen, where he noticed a triangular piece of mirror glued to the wall, stained by flies, in front of which forget-me-nots, periwinkles, and even a garland of marigolds were stuck, showing that it was intended for the stylish flirt's toilette. He saw with horror the truth of their words. Half of his hair had indeed turned white. Homa Brut hung his head and gave himself over to reflection. And now we'll go on. He does make an attempt to escape the village. And he gets as far as the river, stops to take a drink, and finds one of the big burly Cossacks behind him, who brings him back to the village. And this is the start of his third night in the church. "You oughtn't to take such a detour," Yevtuk said. "Much better to take the path I did, straight past the stables. And it's too bad about your coat. Good Bratov, how much did you pay per yard? Anyhow, we had a nice walk." "It's time for home." The philosopher, scratching himself, trudged after Yevtuk. "That accursed witch will give me a hot time now," he thought. "Though what's with me really? What am I afraid of? Am I not a Cossack? I did read for 2 nights. God will help me with the third. The accursed witch must have done a good deal of sinning for the unclean powers to stand by her like that." These reflections occupied him as he entered the master's yard. Having encouraged himself with such observations, he persuaded Dorosh, who through his connection with the steward occasionally had access to the master's cellar, to fetch a jug of rot gut, and the 2 friends sitting under this shed supped not much less than half a bucket, so that the philosopher, suddenly getting to his feet, shouted, "Musicians! We must have musicians!" So he dances and has some more supper, and then Yevtuk, the burly Cossack, comes up. "It's time, let's go." "Bite on a nail, you accursed hog," thought the philosopher, getting to his feet, and then he said, "Let's go." On the way, the philosopher constantly glanced to the right and the left and tried to talk a little bit with his guides. But Yevtuk kept mum. Dorosh himself was untalkative. The night was infernal. Far off, a whole pack of wolves howled, and even the dog's barking was somehow frightening. "Seems like it's something else howling. That's not a wolf," said Dorosh. Yevtuk kept mum. The philosopher found nothing to say. They approached the church and stepped in under its decrepit vaults, which showed how little the owner of the estate cared about God and his own soul. Yevtuk and Dorosh withdrew as before, and the philosopher remained alone. Everything was the same. Everything had the same menacingly familiar look. He paused for a minute. In the middle, as ever, stood the motionless coffin of the terrible witch. "I won't be afraid, by God, I won't be afraid," he said. And again, drawing a circle around himself, he began recalling all his incantations. The silence was dreadful. The candles flickered, pouring light all over the church. The philosopher turned one page, then another, and noticed that he was not reading what was in the book at all. In fear, he crossed himself and began to sing. This cheered him somewhat. The reading went ahead, the pages flashed by one after another. Suddenly, amidst the silence, the iron lid of the coffin split with a crack, and the dead body rose. It was still more horrible than the first time. Its teeth clacked horribly, row against row. Its lips twitched convulsively, and with wild shrieks and incantations came rushing out. Wind whirled through the church. Icons fell to the floor. Broken glass dropped from the windows. The doors tore from the hinges, and numberless hosts of monsters flew into God's church. A terrible noise of wings and scratching claws filled the whole church. Everything flew and rushed about, seeking the philosopher everywhere. Homa's head cleared of the last trace of drunkenness. He just kept crossing himself and reading prayers at random. And at the same time, he heard the unclean powers flitting about him, all but brushing him with the tips of their wings and repulsive tails. He did not have the courage to look at them closely. He only saw the whole wall occupied by a huge monster, standing amidst its own tangled hair as in a forest. Through the web of hair, 2 eyes stared horribly, the eyebrows raised slightly. Above it in the air there was something like an immense bubble, with 1,000 tongues and scorpion stings reaching from its middle. Black earth hung on them in lumps. They all looked at him, searching, unable to see him, surrounded by the mysterious circle. "Bring V! Get V!" the words of the dead body rang out. And suddenly there was silence in the church. The wolves' howling could be heard far away, and soon heavy footsteps rang out in the church. With a sidelong glance, he saw them leading in some squat, hefty, splayed-foot man. He was black earth all over. His earth-covered legs and arms stuck out like strong, sinewy roots. Heavily he trod, stumbling all along. His long eyelids were lowered to the ground. With horror, Homa noticed that the face on him was made of iron. He was brought in under the arms and put right in place where Homa stood. "Lift my eyelids, I can't see," V said in a subterranean voice, and the entire host rushed to lift his eyelids. "Don't look," some inner voice whispered to the philosopher. He could not help himself and looked. "There he is," V cried, and fixed an iron finger on him, and all that were there fell upon the philosopher. Breathless, he crashed to the ground, and straightway the spirit flew out of him in terror. A cock crow rang out. This was already the second cock crow. The monsters had missed the first. The frightened spirits rushed pell-mell for the windows and doors in order to fly out quickly, but nothing doing, and so they stayed there, stuck in the doors and windows. When the first priest came in, he stopped at the sight of such disgrace in God's sanctuary, and did not dare serve a panachida in such a place. So the church remained forever, with monsters stuck in its doors and windows, overgrown with forest, roots, weeds, wild blackthorn, and no one now can find the path to it. So, if you want to see this, it's a terrific movie. Even though it was made in the 60s, it has wonderful special effects. And once again, there's a new version of it coming out. If you like the absurd, the supernatural, the bizarre, Gogol's a wonderful writer. The library has many versions of his books. And I hope you'll all come to the Halloween party, because we're actually showing another movie of another one of Gogol's stories at the party.